The sun was slipping quietly behind the jagged Roman skyline, and a soft wind stirred the long grass that now grew between the ancient paving stones. What once was the bustling heart of the world's most powerful empire had fallen into a hush so deep it felt sacred. You could almost hear the stones murmuring. You were there, just another visitor in the dwindling hours of daylight, standing among broken columns, fragments of arches, and moss-covered altars. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust. Around you rose the ruins of the Roman Forum, or what remained of it, temples with no gods, streets with no voices, and marble steps smoothed not by feet, but by time, and yet something stirred beneath the silence. This place, you'd read, had once been the navel of the world, the umbilicus orbis Romae, the center of the city, and by extension, the universe. From this patch of stone and dirt, emperors had ruled continents, laws had been spoken like thunder, and people had once believed that Rome would never fall. They called it Eterna Roma, eternal Rome. But Rome had fallen, not with a scream, not with flames and bodies as the movies often show, not even with the groan of dying cities. No, Rome had vanished, like a dream fading with the morning, and no one had quite noticed when it happened. That thought hung in the air like a ghost. You took a seat on a worn slab of travertine beneath what remained of the Temple of Saturn. It was cold to the touch, as if the stone still remembered winters from centuries ago. You looked up at the broken columns silhouetted against the amber sky. They loomed like the ribs of a colossal skeleton, silent, proud, and beautiful. The question returned, soft but persistent. How does an empire die so slowly that even its people don't realize it? To begin answering that, you must drift back gently, slowly, like stepping through a veil, back to a time when these stones pulsed with life. Imagine it, the Forum alive, merchants shouting in Latin, senators in white togas with red stripes pacing under porticos, slaves carrying amphorae of olive oil, gossip traded faster than coin, the air thick with smoke from votive offerings, gold-armored generals on horseback parading after victories in distant lands. Rome had not merely existed. It had dominated. It had imposed its will on 3 continents. Roads stretched from the green mist of Britannia to the burning sands of Africa. Aqueducts carved through mountain ranges. Emperors sat like gods beneath canopies of silk, issuing edicts that altered the lives of millions. Yet even at its peak, the cracks had begun to form. Not cracks in marble, but in meaning, in belief. A senator might still walk these steps, but fewer people listened to him. Armies grew vast, but were filled with men who no longer spoke Latin at home. The emperors multiplied, then shrank into irrelevance. And slowly, very slowly, Rome began to forget what it was. The curious thing wasn't how Rome fell. It was how it forgot to notice that it was falling. As you sit in the deepening dusk, you feel this truth more than understand it. It seeps into your bones the way night does, gently, without alarm. The stones don't lie. They are patient storytellers. In fact, some say that Rome didn't fall at all. It simply became something else. The emperors faded. The Senate closed its doors. The Western Empire dissolved into whispers. But the bakers still baked. The carpenters still carved. The mother still sang lullabies to her children. Life, unbothered by the grand narrative of history, moved on. You might expect people to mourn a fallen empire, but few did. Why? Because they didn't wake up one day to find Rome gone. It was not a wall that collapsed in a crash. It was a shoreline that eroded with every wave. The people who lived through it didn't realize they were part of an ending. To them, it felt like just another Tuesday. The coin changed faces. The tacksman wore different boots, but the bread still rose. The fields still needed tending, and Rome, the Rome of the soul, remained for a while. In the twilight, a street lamp buzzes to life behind you. It casts long shadows across the stones. You glance around. The tourists are gone. The guards have not yet come to usher stragglers out. You are alone now with the bones of something vast. And it is quiet here, a deep, knowing kind of quiet. You remember a line you once read? The greatest empires don't fall with a bang. They fade like songs we once loved, but can no longer hum. Perhaps Rome is still here in some way, in the languages we speak, in the arches we build, in the laws we write, and the dreams we dare. But the empire, the living, breathing beast of it, that is gone, and it left no eulogy, no funeral pyre, no final trumpet. Only this: stones in the dust, columns that reach for nothing, the sigh of wind through broken archways, and the whisper of a question in the stillness of the forum. Did you notice when Rome disappeared? You sit a little longer, letting that whisper settle over you like a blanket. The sky is nearly dark now. The last golden light spills like honey across the ruins. It touches your face, your hands, the cold stone beneath you. Somewhere a bell tolls. You stand slowly, almost unwilling to break the silence. But as you walk away from the ruins, you carry something with you, not just facts or history, but a feeling. A sense that not all endings are loud. Some are so quiet, you only hear them centuries later. In the stones, in the wind, in dreams. There are places in the world where the line between myth and memory grows thin. You walk through the veil without noticing one moment, surrounded by history the next. Brushing up against legend, Rome is one of those places. And to truly understand why no one noticed when she fell, you must first return to when she was born. Not in marble halls, but in blood, in river reeds, and in the low growl of a she-wolf. Rome's story does not begin with emperors or armies. It begins with twins, and a mother who never held them. Long before the Forum buzzed with politics, before the aqueducts carried water across arid plains, there were only whispers by the banks of the Tiber River. It was here that two infants, Romulus and Remus, opened their eyes for the first time. Abandoned, left to die by decree of a frightened king. Their bloodline was dangerous, their very existence a threat to the throne. They were cast adrift in a cradle, the river swollen with spring rains. But the river, they say, did not drown them. It carried them to fate, to legend, to the mouth of a cave beneath the Palatine Hill. No one alive remembers the precise moment when a she-wolf found the twins, only that she did. That she bent her wild, terrible head and sniffed the soft, helpless creatures. That she, a beast of fang and instinct, did not devour them but fed them. And so Rome began, nursed not by kings, but by the wilderness. Can you picture her? That she-wolf dark against the dawn sky. Her body curled protectively around the two boys. Her eyes glowing in the shadows, alert, ancient, almost human in their sorrow. From her milk, they drank strength. From her warmth, survival. And from her silence, the first lesson Rome would ever learn. The world is not kind, so you must make yourself stronger than it. Eventually, a shepherd found them, a man named Faustulus. He and his wife took the boys in and raised them in the hills, unaware of their royal heritage. The twins grew fierce and wild, fighting, running, leaping over streams and stones. They were children of the earth, of wind, of fur and claw. And yet destiny has long arms. When the truth of their blood was revealed, princes by birth, grandsons of kings, they returned to the city of Alba Longa, overthrew the usurper Amulius, and restored their grandfather to the throne. But the past, once corrected, was not enough. The twins were not meant to rule a city already built. They were meant to found their own. And so they searched for the right place, for a hill, for a sign, for something they couldn't name but would recognize when they saw it. They found it where the Tiber bent gently, and the 7 hills rose like sentinels. Romulus chose the Palatine Hill, Remus the Aventine. They argued, as brothers often do. They watched the skies looking for omens, flocks of birds, shadows, whispers from the gods. And the gods, ever cruel in their ambiguity, gave them different signs. Neither would yield. Romulus began to build a wall around his hill, a sacred act, a declaration that this place would be his city, his Rome. Remus mocked the wall, leapt over it. Romulus, filled with fury, struck him down. There, in the dirt, blood stained the first stones of Rome. A brother dead by a brother's hand. A wall drawn not just in stone, but in sorrow. Romulus, they say, did not weep. He raised his eyes to the heavens and declared, "So shall it be for anyone who dares to cross Rome's wall." It was a warning, a prophecy, and perhaps a curse. Rome, born of murder, would carry that darkness in her bones. You sit now in the grass, where that wall once stood, nothing left of it, but fragments beneath your feet. The moon hangs pale and low over the city. It lights the contours of the Palatine Hill, softening its edges, but not its weight. It's hard to believe this place was once wilderness. Harder still to believe that one man, one boy raised by wolves, could draw a line in the earth and birth a civilization. But he did. Romulus ruled for years, alone. Heavy is the crown, heavier still when worn over guilt. His city grew, slowly at first, then faster. She welcomed exiles, criminals, outcasts. Rome, from the beginning, was a city of second chances. Not pure, but strong. Not just, but enduring. That was her genius. Not perfection, but survival. And when Romulus finally vanished, swallowed by a storm, or perhaps lifted into the heavens, the people said he had become a god. Quirinus, they called him. But even gods leave footprints. Even legends have shadows. The stones beneath your fingers are cool with dew now. The forum sleeps behind you. The stars are out quiet and watchful. You think of the twins, one buried, one deified. You think of the wall, the brother, the blood. And you begin to understand something. Rome did not rise because of justice. Rome did not rise because of truth. She rose because she could. Because someone dared to draw a line and say, "This is where the world begins." Rome was not born of peace. She was born of struggle. And that is why, when she died, no one noticed. Because the struggle never stopped. It just changed names. As you walk down the dark path from the Palatine, your foot brushes something, a stone, a root, or perhaps a fragment of that first wall. You pause, look back once. There is nothing there, but you can almost hear it. Not a roar, not a cry, just the soft, steady heartbeat of a city that remembered the wolves. Morning settles slowly over the hills of Latium, drawing golden fingers across the rooftops of a city that still smells of damp earth and smoke. Rome is awake, but not yet Rome as we know her. She is still a child, a gathering of huts, a patchwork of ambition, a name whispered more than spoken. Yet beneath that name, something ancient is stirring. Not destiny, not glory, but will. It is the 8th century BCE, and Rome is young. Her boundaries are modest, just a cluster of wooden homes and sacred hearths hemmed in by 7 hills. Livestock bleat in the streets. Traders haggle beneath makeshift awnings. Chickens peck at the dust between shrines and wells. But listen carefully. Beneath this noise lies something else order. Even in her infancy, Rome organizes. She builds. She plans. The kings of early Rome, some real, some cloaked in myth, begin to shape the city into something permanent. Romulus gone, but remembered, is followed by Numa, the priest king. Numa brings the gods into the city, not as thunderbolts and visions, but as rituals. He teaches Rome to count time in months. He builds temples, codifies law, praise, not for victory, but for structure. It is in this stage of Rome's life that she learns her most dangerous talent, to absorb and refine, to take what she finds and make it Roman. The Etruscans north of the Tiber are older and wealthier. Their cities gleam with metalwork and grand tombs. They have kings, augurs, artists. Rome learns from them, borrows their architecture, their divination, even their pride. The Greeks farther south bring wine coinage alphabet. Rome listens. She imitates their myths, reworks their gods into new forms. Zeus becomes Jupiter Hera, becomes Juno Athena, becomes Minerva. But Rome does not worship beauty like the Greeks. She worships virtues, strength, discipline, loyalty to duty. To be Roman is not to be brilliant. It is to endure, and endure she does. By the time the monarchy falls, driven out by noble families who bristled at tyranny, Rome is no longer a village. She is becoming a city. And what a strange, ruthless, fascinating city she is. The kings are gone. In their place stands a new idea, res publica, the republic. Power now lies in the hands of the people. Or so the people are told. In truth, it lies with the Senate, a body of aristocratic men, old in age and older in pride. They wear togas edged in purple speak, in clipped Latin, and make laws with a wave of the hand. And yet Rome does not promise equality. She promises opportunity, to rise, to earn a name, to carve your place into the marble of time. It is in this crucible that the Roman soul is forged, not in luxury, but in tension. Between patricians and plebeians, between liberty and law, between ambition and duty. And war, always war, Rome still surrounded by rival tribes and restless hills begins to march. Not out of greed, but out of necessity. Every neighbor is a threat. Every alliance is temporary. To survive is to expand. To defend is to conquer. And so one by one, Rome subdues the Latin League, then the Sabines, then the Aequi, the Volsci, the Samnites. These are not glorious wars. They are ugly, hard, repetitive. But Rome does not retreat. She bleeds. She suffers defeats. Entire legions are lost in mountain passes and ambushes. But Rome always returns. She learns, she adapts, she builds roads back to her failures and marches over them again. It is during these years of expansion that Rome makes a pact with death. Her soldiers are not allowed to fear it. They fight in perfect rectangles, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. They are not brilliant swordsmen. They are bricks in a human wall, each one replaceable. And they march under the standard of SPQR Senatus Populusque, Romanus the Senate, and people of Rome. Not of one man, not of a king, but of a collective will. You can almost hear their footsteps echoing. Even now, can't you? That rhythmic thud of sandals on stone, the clatter of iron on iron, the breath of men who have already accepted the worst and chosen to march anyway. And all the while, back in the city, Rome is changing. Markets swell. The forum takes shape. Families rise and fall based on victory and scandal. The 12 tables, the first codified laws, are etched onto bronze and displayed for all to read. And still, the struggle never ends. The plebeians want rights. The patricians resist. Riots flare. Tribunes are appointed. Power is negotiated, never given. Rome's greatness lies not in peace, but in the friction of opposing forces. It is a city that never lets you sleep, but it rewards those who endure the noise. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome's boot-shaped peninsula is nearly hers. But now, a greater challenge awaits across the sea. A city older, richer, and more powerful Carthage. That is a tale for another night. But know this, the first steps of empire do not begin in victory. They begin in hunger. A hunger for permanence. A hunger to never be forgotten. You sit again in the forum, now dappled with late morning light. A child chases pigeons across the stones. Somewhere a guide speaks Italian, their voice bouncing off the columns. But the real voice you hear is older. It is the voice of a people who refused to stay small, who refused to vanish into the hills, who looked at the world and said, "We will not merely live, we will leave a mark." And they did. With every road, with every battle, with every stone set in this sacred square. Rome was walking now, and she would not stop for 1,000 years. There comes a moment in every long walk where the steps no longer feel difficult. The breath is steady, the rhythm smooth. The world yields not because it has been conquered yet, but because it knows the traveler will not stop. That moment came for Rome, and when it did, the world began to bend. Not all at once, not with banners and horns, but with roads, with treaties, with soldiers who didn't come home because they became the new locals. The Republic was no longer merely surviving. It was becoming inevitable. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Rome stood not as a regional power, but as a rising supernova. Italy was hers through alliance intimidation or outright force. Cities that had once fought against her now sent troops for her campaigns. Local gods were folded into the Roman pantheon. Latin spread like the tide, lapping at every village and hilltop. But across the water, another city watched. Carthage, a mirror of Rome in many ways, proud, ancient, wealthy. A city of traders and seafarers. A city that remembered the old gods of Tyre and had grown fat on silver and spice. For a while, the two powers circled each other like lions on the edge of the same savanna. But two lions cannot share a single kill. The Punic Wars changed everything. You may have heard the names Hannibal, Scipio, Cannae, Zama. But beneath the drama, something far deeper occurred. Rome discovered what it meant to be mortal, and chose once again to rise anyway. Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants. He outwitted Roman generals again and again. At Cannae, he surrounded and slaughtered nearly 50,000 Roman soldiers in a single day. Entire families were erased. Entire cities went silent. But Rome did not break. She recruited boys, old men, slaves. She taxed herself to the bone. She bled for years. She refused to surrender. And eventually, she adapted, as always, and then she turned the tide. When Carthage fell in 146 BCE, it was not merely defeated, it was erased. Its walls pulled down, its harbor burned, its fields, some said, sown with salt. Though that part may be myth, the message was not. Resist Rome and vanish. From there, the world opened like a flower. Spain, Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, Gaul. Each new conquest brought more land, more slaves, more gods, more gold. But it also brought something harder to hold. Complexity, because empire is not just about marching. It is about managing. The Republic strained under its own expansion. Legions that once fought for Rome now fought for their generals. Wealth poured into the capital, but most of it settled into the pockets of a few. The gap between rich and poor widened. The city swelled with displaced farmers desperate for grain and coin. Riots erupted. Tribunes were assassinated. Reformers came and went. Gracchus, Marius, Sulla, all promising change, all leaving behind more chaos than they solved. And in the background, the Senate squabbled. Old men in white togas argued while the provinces burned. Rome had conquered the world, but she had not yet learned to govern it. Still outwardly the world bent. The legions built roads that stretched over 400,000 kilometers. Milestones were placed so that every traveler knew how far they stood from Rome. Temples rose in faraway lands dedicated to Roman gods. Latin began to weave its way into local dialects. Amphitheaters, baths, and aqueducts sprang up like marble blossoms. To be Roman was not just to hold a passport. It was to live within an idea, order, power, legacy. And here lies the paradox. As Rome grew stronger, the Republic grew weaker. The very men who expanded the empire began to wonder, why not rule it all? One such man would change everything. You've heard his name, Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was not the first to cross a line, but he made the crossing unforgettable. In 49 BCE, he stood on the banks of the Rubicon River with a single legion at his back. The law was clear, no general was to bring troops into Italy. He looked at the water, then he stepped forward. And so began the final collapse of the Roman Republic. Caesar took Rome, not in a blaze of destruction, but in a wave of inevitability. He pardoned his enemies' enacted reforms and made himself dictator for life. And then, on the Ides of March, in a Senate chamber lined with marble and ambition, they stabbed him 23 times. His blood spilled beneath a statue of Pompey. They believed they were saving the Republic. They were wrong. The wars that followed were colder, more cynical. Octavian Caesar's adopted heir emerged victorious, young, calculating, patient. He renamed himself Augustus. And with that, the Republic became the empire. Not by law, not by vote, but by exhaustion. The people were tired of wars, of chaos, of senators with daggers. They longed for peace, and Augustus gave them that at a price. Freedom bent to order, pride bent to stability, the world bent to Rome. You sit now on the Palatine Hill, where Augustus once raised temples to glory and memory. The air is warm. Rome is quiet beneath you. Tourists pass below like ghosts. The old stones breathe slowly in the sun. You think about what it means to bend the world, to reach across mountains and oceans and impose not just power, but identity, to write laws in stone and expect the universe to obey, to stand atop a city built not just by hands, but by belief. And perhaps you begin to understand Rome was not loved for her goodness. She was admired for her gravity. You did not have to like her. You simply could not ignore her. She was the sun, and everything else revolved. There's something strange that happens when a civilization reaches its peak. From a distance, everything gleams. Temples shine white in the sun. Statues of gods and emperors line marble colonnades. Fountains spill endlessly with clear water. The streets echo with the murmur of Latin and the clatter of sandals. To walk through Rome at the height of its power was to believe you had entered the very heart of the world. But lean in closer and you'll see the cracks. Hairline fractures beneath the marble. Not in the buildings, in the soul. Augustus gave Rome what she craved, stability. He draped the corpse of the Republic in silken robes and called it the Empire. Senators still gathered, but no one doubted where the real power lay. The people cheered because the wars had ended. Bread was cheap. Games were grand. But in buying peace, Rome had also bought silence. The kind of silence that lets rot grow unseen. For all her shining avenues and golden statues, Rome had a shadow self. A darker city that breathed beneath the grandeur. You didn't see it from the steps of the Senate or the balconies of villas. But it was there down alleyways that stank of waste, in tenements so cramped that families slept in shifts on streets where the sick lay ignored. The empire had grown fat, but not fair. The conquests had brought more than gold and glory. They had brought people, millions of them enslaved, displaced, uprooted from distant lands and sold like animals. In Egypt and Gaul, in Judea, Rome brought order. But to the conquered, that order often came in the form of chains. You see them now if you look with different eyes. The nameless hands that lifted every column, carved every relief, paved every road. The children of Nubia, the women of Thrace, the artisans of Syria, stripped of names, folded into the machinery of empire. Rome praised discipline, valor, honor, but her greatness was built on backs bent by force. And then there was the wealth, so much of it pouring in from the provinces, gold from Spain, marble from Greece, silks from the East, slaves from everywhere. Senators who once debated law now debated luxury, how many fountains to build, how many slaves to parade, how many villas to fill with peacocks and musicians. The streets grew louder, but the values quieter. No one noticed, or no one dared to speak of it. But the old Roman virtues, frugalitas, disciplina, gravitas, began to disappear like mist at dawn. What replaced them? Spectacle. You can almost hear the roar of the Colosseum. 50,000 people thirsty for blood, cheering as men are mauled by animals as gladiators slice each other for glory. It's easy to forget today how normal this was, how expected, how celebrated. The games were not just entertainment. They were distraction, a promise from the emperors. You will suffer, but you will forget. You will be poor, but you will be entertained. You will never rule, but you will always watch. Even the emperors began to change. Augustus was careful, measured, almost reluctant in his power. But those who followed him, some were wise, most were not. Tiberius withdrew into paranoia. Caligula drowned in madness. Nero set fire to his own city while dreaming of music and marble. For every Marcus Aurelius, there was a Commodus, and all the while the Senate stood in silence, because they no longer ruled. They nodded, they feared, they survived. You might ask, how could such a powerful empire allow such rot? But that's the thing about shadows. They grow slowly, quietly. While the city laughed and danced, the foundations began to crack, and no one wanted to look down. Even the legions, the pride of Rome, began to change. They were still disciplined, still feared, but they were no longer Roman. Many were born in distant provinces, raised not on Latin poetry, but local tongues. Their loyalties were to their generals, not to the Senate. Increasingly, emperors rose through military acclaim, not blood or law. Power was no longer passed down. It was seized. Rome had become an empire of emperors, but she had no clear way to choose them. Behind every marble facade, a quiet truth festered. Rome had conquered the world, but she had not conquered herself. You sit now beneath the Arch of Titus, where the story of conquest is carved in stone. The sack of Jerusalem, the looting of temples, the victory parades. A menorah held high by faceless soldiers. Triumph frozen forever in limestone. It's beautiful in a way, and chilling, because it reminds you that empires don't collapse in storms. They drown in still water. They die not when they are weakest, but when they are unaware of their own sickness. Rome still looks eternal from a distance, but you are close enough now to feel it. The shadow under the marble, the silence beneath the cheers, the rot that spreads behind closed villa doors. The great paradox of empire is this: to hold the world, you must carry its weight. And Rome had stretched her arms so wide, she no longer felt how heavy the burden had become. Even now, as birds wheel in the sky above the ruins, as sunlight dances on broken stone, you can feel the echoes of this truth. That nothing, not even Rome, is beyond erosion. That power once earned must be nurtured. That glory without virtue becomes a hollow echo. And that somewhere, sometime, a crack appeared beneath all the grandeur, and no one looked down. There was a time when to be Roman was not simply to live in Rome. It was to carry a name, to wear a certain kind of cloak, to speak Latin in the Forum, and to command the world's respect through bloodline and law. But the world does not stand still, and neither does identity. By the 3rd century, CE Rome's boundaries had stretched so far that her people no longer resembled the shepherds who once huddled beside the Tiber. And her legions, those unstoppable engines of discipline and conquest, were no longer filled with men who knew the hills of Latium or who knelt before Jupiter as boys. They were foreigners. You may picture Rome's army, as a polished force of Italians marching in tight formation beneath the eagle standard, their armor gleaming in the sun. That vision is old, and by now it is a ghost. The soldiers who kept Rome alive in her later years came from far beyond her founding hills. They were Gauls, Thracians, Syrians, Egyptians, and more, they were Germans, men from beyond the Rhine. Men Rome had once called barbari barbarians. Now they wore her armor. Now they stood at her gates. Now they bled and died to keep her breathing. It hadn't happened overnight. The change was slow, as all great changes are. Rome had always relied on outsiders, auxiliaries, scouts, archers, specialists. But now, with her citizens avoiding military service, with birth rates falling, and with the frontiers under constant threat, the empire had no choice but to fill its legions with those it had once feared. And the irony was painful. The empire that had built walls to keep them out now relied on them to hold those very walls. At first, it worked. The foederati, or federated tribes, were granted land and protection in exchange for service. Whole peoples like the Franks, the Goths, and the Alemanni were allowed to settle within the empire's borders under treaties that blurred the line between citizen and invader. They fought well, fiercely, but they were not Romans. Not in language, not in law, not in loyalty. Imagine a young Gothic warrior, tall, fair-haired, raised on stories of Woden and forest spirits, now standing on the Roman frontier, dressed in second-hand mail, guarding a city whose gods he does not know, and whose language he barely speaks. He is paid in coin that loses value every year. He is commanded by officers who sneer at his name. He is sent to die for an emperor he will never meet. How long, you might ask, before he forgets whom he serves? How long before he sees the empire, not as mother, but as mistress, old, cold, and ungrateful? The problem wasn't just cultural, it was political. Rome had become a place of ceaseless ambition and fear. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, some lasting only months, others only days. In the 3rd century alone, more than 20 emperors were murdered or overthrown. The legions chose their own leaders. Generals marched on Rome not to protect it, but to claim it. Loyalty was no longer to the state, but to whoever promised the most silver. Power shifted like sand, and into that chaos stepped men who had never dreamed of Rome, but now found themselves inside her gates. One of them was Odoacer, a chieftain of Germanic origin, a soldier, a commander, and eventually the man who would be remembered falsely or not as the one who ended the Western Roman Empire. In 476 CE, Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor in the West. But it was not a dramatic event. There were no riots, no fires, no thunder from the heavens. The emperor was just a boy, and the empire was already hollow. The truth is, by the time Odoacer took the throne, there was nothing left to conquer. The Senate still met, but their words had no teeth. The cities still stood, but they were crumbling. The roads still stretched to the horizon, but few travelers remained. It was not a fall, not really. It was a transfer of weight from one dying world to a new one. And Odoacer, he did not claim to destroy Rome. He called himself Patricius, a Roman title. He ruled from Italy. He kept Roman laws, Roman customs, Roman language. To the average person, farmer, merchant, child, It didn't feel like the end of anything. The foreigner who now wore the purple robe acted much like the ones who had worn it before. Only his accent was different. You sit now at the crumbled edge of the Roman wall in Britain. Wind whistles through the stones. Once this barrier held back the wild north. Now it holds back nothing but time. The legions are long gone. The garrison's abandoned. But the road still stretches before you, and it tells a story that borders do not last forever, that walls fall, and that sometimes the people we call outsiders become the ones who carry our legacy forward. There's a quiet kind of irony in it. The empire, so obsessed with purity and control, was preserved not by its citizens, but by the very strangers it feared. It was the barbarians who kept the lights on, who learned Latin, who guarded cities, who became in a way the last Romans. And perhaps that is why no one noticed when the empire ended, because the armor still gleamed, the standards still flew, the taxes were still collected, the language still echoed in courtrooms and prayers. Only the names had changed, only the faces beneath the helmets. So ask yourself, what is Rome? A city, a people, a dream. Maybe Rome was never a place. Maybe it was an idea worn like armor, passed from hand to hand, from emperor to soldier, from citizen to stranger. And when that idea grew too heavy, it found new shoulders to carry it. Stand atop the Palatine Hill as the sun dips behind the horizon and the shadows of the Forum stretch long like reaching fingers. You can still imagine it. The thunder of chariots, the cries of the market, the echo of imperial commands. But listen carefully. Beneath that grandeur lies a whisper, a fracture you cannot see in stone, but can feel in the silence. Rome did not fall in a single blow. She broke slowly like a statue left too long in the rain. And perhaps her most defining break, the one from which she would never truly heal, was the moment she became two Romes. The empire had grown too large. It was a beast with too many limbs, spanning deserts, forests, coasts, and mountain ranges. No single man, no matter how wise or ruthless, could rule it all from one marble throne. By the end of the 3rd century, that truth was unavoidable. Administrators couldn't respond fast enough to crises in distant provinces. Barbarians probed every border. The economy was cracking. Armies were loyal to generals, not emperors. Inflation spiraled. Silver coins turned to bronze. Rome was gasping for breath beneath the weight of its own greatness. And so, a decision was made. A practical one. A desperate one. Divide the empire. It began with Diocletian, a soldier emperor hardened by battle, uninterested in poetry or politics. He believed order was salvation and bureaucracy the sword of stability. In 285 CE, he split the empire into eastern and western halves. He would rule the east. His colleague Maximian would rule the west, not as a true division, but as a tetrarchy, a rule of 4. 2 senior emperors, 2 juniors beneath them. A network of power. On paper, it was genius. In practice, it was prophecy. Because from that moment forward, Rome was no longer Rome. It was Rome's. The East thrived. Its cities were old, wealthy, and culturally rich. Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus. Trade flowed from India, Persia, Africa. Gold glittered in the vaults. Its population was dense, educated, diverse. Its language, Greek, not Latin. Its religion, already leaning toward Christianity. The West, meanwhile, was poorer, rougher, more dependent on farms and fading loyalty. Roads fell into disrepair, garrisons went unpaid, cities shrank, and yet this was the heartland, the soil of Italy, the name of Rome itself. But soil cannot stop a tide. Then came Constantine, a man of vision and contradiction, brutal in battle, yet drawn to faith. He fought civil wars, crushed rivals, and in 330 CE did something unthinkable. He founded a new capital on the site of ancient Byzantium, beside the blue waters of the Bosphorus. He built a gleaming city of domes and columns, Constantinople. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome, but the name didn't matter. What mattered was that the center had shifted. The empire now looked east, and though no one said it aloud, the West had been left behind. It would take more than a century for that truth to bloom, but bloom it did, as the East fortified its borders and restructured its bureaucracy. The West unraveled. Not in fire, not in a single invasion, but in silence, in neglect. The emperors in the West were weaker, poorer, and often puppets to stronger generals or foreign warlords. Their courts were filled with intrigue, not vision. Their armies were mercenaries, their cities unguarded. Rome, the eternal city, became a symbol more than a seat of power. Meanwhile, Constantinople flourished. It had aqueducts, baths, palaces. It had scholars and senators' churches and silk markets. Its walls, enormous, unbreachable, would protect it for 1,000 years. And though it called itself Roman, spoke Greek, and wore Eastern robes, it looked less and less like the city by the Tiber. Some still held on to the illusion that Rome was one, that East and West were brothers, not strangers. But illusion cannot hold back history, and history was changing fast. By the mid-5th century, the split was final in all but name. When Attila the Hun swept through the West, the East paid him to go away. When Gothic kings seized Italy, the East watched. And when the last Western emperor was deposed in 476 CE, the Eastern court did not march to restore him. They issued polite letters and kept ruling from Constantinople. You might ask, did the people know? Did they wake up one morning and feel the world was different? Most likely no. A merchant in Carthage still paid taxes to a governor. A farmer in Gaul still harvested grain for Rome's name. But the messengers were slower. The coins were debased. The temples stood quieter. And over time, as new kings rose and old statues fell, the people adjusted not out of rebellion, but out of fatigue. Rome didn't vanish. It thinned. It drifted. It stopped being one world and became many. Tonight, as you walk the edge of the Bosphorus, the lights of Istanbul twinkling across the dark water, remember this. This city, once Constantinople, was not built to replace Rome. It was built because Rome could not contain herself. She had grown too large, too complicated, too tired. So she split not in shame, but in survival. Like a tree that grows two trunks from a single root. One would bloom, the other would rot. Yet even in that division, Rome endured. Her laws were studied, her titles mimicked, her symbols copied, and her dream that the world could be ruled by order and reason, and roads never truly died. It just moved. So when people ask, when did Rome fall? Perhaps the answer lies here, not in 476, but in 285, when Diocletian drew a line across the empire, and no one could quite remember how to erase it. He was just a boy. No legends would be written about him. No triumphal arches raised. No coin minted in his name would ever gleam under a Roman sun. To history, he would become a footnote, Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a child with a crown too heavy for his neck, and a name far too big for his fate. Think about that for a moment. Romulus, the name of the city's mythical founder, the wolf-suckled king who drew the first sacred line around the Palatine Hill. Augustus, the name of the first emperor, the quiet architect of Rome's imperial golden age. And yet this Romulus Augustulus, born in a dying world, was no warrior, no lawgiver, no founder of dynasties. He was a shadow of shadows, a symbol with no sword. The year was 475 CE. The city of Rome, once the beating heart of civilization, was now only a husk. It had been sacked twice, left bleeding by Visigoths and Vandals. Its gold stripped its statues, toppled its gods forgotten. The emperors no longer ruled from there. They had retreated to Ravenna, a marshy fortress city better defended by swamps than by legions. Romulus did not inherit power. He was placed on the throne like a puppet, a ceremonial child seated on a broken chair. His father Orestes, a Roman general of barbarian birth, had seized power by force. When the previous emperor Julius Nepos fled to Dalmatia, Orestes installed his son as emperor. It was a gesture, a curtain over a crumbling stage. Imagine being that boy, barely a teenager, crowned with imperial laurels while knowing perhaps deep down that none of it was real, that the throne had no legs, that the armies swore loyalty not to Rome, not to law, but to the loudest voice and the largest purse. He must have known, because the whole world around him knew. The empire wasn't falling anymore. It had already fallen. And then came Odoacer, not a senator, not a Roman, a general of Germanic birth, leader of the Foederati foreign soldiers, long stationed within the empire, unpaid and restless. They had bled for Rome. But now Rome could no longer pay. Odoacer demanded land for his men. Orestes refused. So Odoacer raised a sword and marched. There was no great battle, no siege remembered in song. Orestes was captured and executed. His brother was murdered in Pavia. And Romulus, the child emperor, was brought before Odoacer. But Odoacer did not kill him. He saw no threat in the boy. He stripped him of his title, gave him a pension, and sent him to live quietly in Campania. A soft ending for a soft emperor. No blood, no last stand, no martyrdom. And that was the end. But no one cried. No one wrote eulogies in the streets. There was no rebellion, no resistance. No one rose to restore the boy emperor. No one declared war for his return, because by then the idea of Rome was already hollow. Even in the East, where the Roman Empire still clung to life in Constantinople, there was no rush to reclaim the West. The Eastern Emperor Zeno acknowledged Odoacer's rule. Diplomacy replaced dreams. What did it matter who wore the purple in Italy when the real power had moved east of the Adriatic? What did it matter that Rome had fallen when no one felt the quake? Here's the haunting truth. The last emperor of the West vanished, and the world went on. Merchants still traded. Churches still held mass. Cows still grazed on hills, that once echoed with marching legions. The collapse didn't feel like collapse. It felt like fog, settling, staying. Sometimes when something dies slowly, no one notices the moment of death. There's no heartbeat to stop, no curtain to fall, no final word, only stillness. And then life reshaped around the absence. You sit now near the coast of Naples, where Romulus Augustulus may have lived his final years in quiet exile. The waves crash gently. The sea is calm. He never returned to politics, never raised a rebellion, never wrote memoirs. History swallowed him like a stone dropped into deep water. Only ripples remain, and maybe in that silence there's a lesson. That empires don't always end in fire. Sometimes they end in sleep. A child laid down the scepter, and no one asked him to pick it up again. So when they ask, who was the last Roman emperor? You can tell them. A boy, too young to lead, too late to matter, too soft to break, and maybe just Roman enough to let it all go. If you had been there, you might have missed it. No trumpet sounded, no city wall collapsed, no prophecy cracked open the sky. When the Western Roman Empire ended, there was no funeral, no feast, no fire. Only the gentle clink of wooden spoons. Only the bubbling of lentils in blackened pots. Only the quiet laughter of a child playing in dust, while her father, hands calloused from a life of labor, returned home before the last light faded. Because the day the empire ended, the people still ate supper. It's easy from centuries away to picture the end of Rome as a dramatic thing. A city in flames, temples crumbling, emperors stabbed beneath marble domes. But empires do not always die like kings on battlefields. Sometimes they wither, and as they wither, the people who live inside them simply adapt. Let's imagine a man in the year 476. He lives in the hills of Umbria. His name is Lucius, though no one uses it much anymore. He tills the same patch of earth his father did, using tools that haven't changed in generations. His back aches from a life spent bent toward the soil. That morning he wakes before sunrise. The air is cool. The sun hasn't broken the horizon yet. He rubs his eyes, eats a crust of old bread, and leads his mule out to the fields. He hasn't heard of Odoacer. He doesn't know the emperor is gone. He doesn't even know his name was Romulus Augustulus. All Lucius knows is that he owes grain to the landlord, that wolves have been near the orchard, and that his daughter is running a fever. He knows what matters. Not marble, not titles, but supper. And so that evening he returns home. The sun is low. A fire is burning. His wife is stirring a pot of soup. The herbs are dry but fragrant. She's added garlic, maybe a scrap of pork if they were lucky this week. Their son is carving a wooden toy with a knife, passed down from a grandfather who once fought in the legions. They will sit on stones worn smooth with time. They will eat together. They will thank the gods, or maybe the saints. They will not know that the last emperor is gone. And if they did, they might shrug. Because what truly had the emperor done for them lately, the world above them had been dying for decades. Taxes had grown heavier. Coins had lost weight. Soldiers had become strangers who spoke strange languages. Laws were made in distant cities they had never seen. Rome was already fading, but supper remained. Even in Rome itself, old hollowed Rome, there was no panic. The senators no longer ruled. The baths stood cold. The great amphitheater had lost its voice, but the baker still baked. The merchant still counted coppers. The priests still lit candles. Children still threw stones in alleyways where orators once thundered. People adjusted because they had to, and because they always have. Look at any fallen civilization, and you'll find this truth. The people keep living, not because they are blind to change, but because bread must be baked, fields must be sown, children must be rocked to sleep. The death of an empire is not the death of a people. It is the death of an illusion, a story grown too large to hold. And when that story ends, a new one begins. In kitchens, in fields, in quiet, resilient hearts. History records the dates, the emperors, the treaties, the wars. But it forgets the soup on the fire. It forgets the woman who patched her husband's tunic by candlelight. It forgets the boy who watched the stars and wondered if the gods had changed with the emperor or stayed the same. It forgets that the world did not collapse into silence. It continued in smaller voices. Somewhere, a priest was writing in poor Latin, trying to preserve what he could of the old laws. Somewhere, a Gothic warlord was using Roman titles to govern Roman cities. Somewhere, the scrolls of Virgil and Cicero were being copied by monks who barely understood them. And somewhere else entirely, a family was sitting down to supper, eating with their hands, laughing softly, worried about nothing more than the coming rain. They would survive, and in doing so, would Rome. Because Rome was never just marble. It was rhythm. It was repetition. It was bread in the morning and oil in the lamp at night. It was habit and memory and quiet resilience. It was supper eaten in twilight, shared between people who called this place home, even if the name above the gate had changed. And so, the next morning, life would go on. The mule would be led out again. The pot would be scrubbed clean. The sky would shift as it always does. And no one perhaps would remember the boy emperor who disappeared into history. But they would remember how to feed their children. They would remember how to plant, how to sow, how to sing old songs. And in doing so, they would build something new. Not an empire, but a future. You sit now beneath a broken arch. The wind brushes your cheek. The stars above are unchanged, those same stars that watched Caesar cross the Rubicon, that watched Romulus draw his sacred line in the dirt, that now watch you. The empire is gone, but the world is still turning, and the people still eat supper, just as they always have. There is a story we like to tell, that Rome fell because it was overrun, that the gates were broken, the temples looted, the libraries set on fire, that hairy, snarling men in animal skins stormed in from the dark forests of the north and crushed 1,000 years of civilization beneath their filthy boots. But stories are rarely so simple, and this one, like all great endings, is more quiet than cruel, more subtle than savage. Because the so-called barbarians didn't destroy Rome, they became it. Let's go back step by step, brick by brick, to that crumbling edge of empire. The Roman army, once a finely tuned machine, had been evolving for centuries. Gone were the days of farm boys from Latium marching in perfect squares. By the 4th century, the legions were filled with men from the frontiers, Goths, Franks, Alemanni, Vandals. Men whose names, skin, and speech were once foreign, but they had bled in Roman battles, worn Roman armor, served under Roman standards. Some were granted land for their service. Some rose through the ranks. Some married Roman women, learned Latin, baptized their children in Roman churches. They did not want to burn Rome. They wanted to be part of it. And when Rome could no longer pay, its soldiers could no longer protect its cities, could no longer hold the weight of its own name. It wasn't the barbarians who knocked her down. It was gravity, the weight of too much land, too few soldiers, too many enemies, too much corruption. The gates weren't kicked in. They were opened quietly, diplomatically often, in exchange for bread gold or political recognition. Consider Alaric, king of the Visigoths. In 410 CE, he marched on Rome not as a mindless invader, but as a frustrated ally. He had served the empire. He had asked, pleaded, demanded land and dignity for his people. Rome refused. And so, in bitter anger, he entered the Eternal City. The first time in 800 years it had been breached by a foreign army. And yet, his men were ordered not to burn churches. The sack was real, yes, but not apocalyptic. Not the fall of fire and fury we imagine. Or take Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths. He ruled Italy after Odoacer, not as a barbarian tyrant, but as a Roman-style monarch. He wore the purple. He preserved Roman laws. He employed Roman bureaucrats. He repaired aqueducts and baths. He funded schools. His court in Ravenna became a jewel of late Roman culture, glittering with mosaics, Latin poetry, and Christian theology. His people called him the New Trajan, and yet he was a man from beyond the Danube, a stranger who understood Rome better than many born beneath her eagles. These men were not here to destroy. They were here to inherit, to reshape, to wear the skin of Rome like a garment and stitch it to their own bones. Because Rome had done the same long ago. She had absorbed Etruscans, Greeks, Carthaginians. She had stolen God's ideas, customs, and made them Roman. Now it was her turn. Her culture, her laws, her symbols were being borrowed, not burned. Even the word rex, once taboo in the Republic King, returned in new forms. Roi, rei, re, ri. The kings of medieval Europe did not call themselves barbarians. They called themselves Roman in lineage, in law, in ambition. Charlemagne, crowned in 800 CE, called his realm the Holy Roman Empire, a dream of restoration. Even as centuries passed, kings and popes alike traced their legitimacy back to Rome, not to its fall, but to its memory. And so the barbarians did not sweep Rome away. They built themselves on top of her. They planted wheat where legions once marched. They built cathedrals from stones once laid in Caesar's day. They copied scrolls in dim candlelight. They told their children Roman stories in broken Latin, wearing crosses the empire had once fashioned from its own wood and nails. You walk now through the streets of modern Ravenna. The mosaics still shimmer. Gold tiles catch the sun. Christ looks down with Roman cheekbones, framed in imperial purple. This was Theodoric's city. His throne is gone, but the walls still whisper. Not of ruin, but of transformation. So what then is a barbarian? A word, a wall, a boundary drawn by people who fear the other side. To Rome, a barbarian was anyone beyond the frontiers. But frontiers shift, and names change, and today's outsider becomes tomorrow's heir. It is tempting to draw a sharp line between empire and collapse. But Rome did not collapse. It became soil, fertilizer, roots, the seedbed of Europe. Its laws became the backbone of canon and civil codes. Its roads became trade routes. Its villas became monasteries. Its speech fractured into new tongues, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, like rivers pouring from the same spring. Rome is dead, and yet it speaks through every Western tongue. So when they say the barbarians destroyed Rome, tell them, no, the barbarians dined at Rome's table, wore her robes, dreamed her dreams, and when she could no longer stand, they picked up her torch and carried it into a darker age, not as conquerors, but as inheritors. It began not with a coronation, but with a whisper, a hymn echoing through marble halls that once heard only laws and war plans. A flicker of candlelight in a shrine built where a senate once ruled. A bishop in worn robes standing where a general might have once drawn a sword. When Rome lost her emperors, her armies, her breath, she did not fall silent. She simply changed voice, and that voice began to speak in prayer. For centuries, the Roman world had balanced gods like tools, Jupiter for victory, Mars for war, Vesta for hearth. Religion was civic, public, performative. An offering was a transaction, a pact between human and divine. But something had shifted. A new faith, once mocked, then feared, then persecuted Christianity, had survived. And in surviving it grew. Underground, in catacombs, in whispers, in refusal. Then, astonishingly, at the center. By the early 4th century, the cross was no longer a criminal's shame. It was an imperial symbol. When Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 332 CE, he cracked open a door. When he converted, he flung that door wide. And when Theodosius III declared Christianity the official religion of the empire in 380, the old gods fled into memory. The temples grew quiet, the sacrifices ceased, and the bishops began to rise. Rome, the empire of stone and steel, had long ruled through power. But now power changed hands. The church did not conquer through armies. It conquered through continuity. When emperors vanished, when generals died, when cities turned to ash, the bishop remained. The doors of the church still opened. The prayers were still spoken, and people tired of war, of shifting banners, of empty promises, turned to the one place that hadn't left them. Look at a crumbling Roman city in the 5th or 6th century. The governor's palace is abandoned. The roads are overgrown. The statues are defaced. But the church bell still rings. The priest still visits the sick. The parish still gathers on Sundays, speaking Latin, not in law, but in liturgy. It was not just spiritual. The church became administrator, judge, scribe, mediator, record keeper, teacher. When Rome's state structure fell away, the clergy filled its shape. The bishop was now the voice of order. And the most powerful among them, the Bishop of Rome, a man the world would come to call Pope. It's a strange, quiet irony. The man who now held sway in the city of emperors claimed no army, no wealth, no crown. And yet, he was heard. He was feared. He was obeyed. The empire had ruled bodies. Now the church ruled souls. And this new Rome, this Christian Rome, spread its roots deeper than roads or taxes ever could. It did not demand tribute. It demanded belief. And belief once planted is not easily removed. You might imagine Rome at this point as a ruined shell. But look again. Look at the basilicas rising beside collapsed forums. Look at the processions, the relics, the incense drifting where senators once shouted. Look at the popes sending letters to kings, crowning rulers declaring heretics. The throne of Caesar had no heir, but the throne of Peter, it endured. By the 8th and 9th centuries, it was the Pope who would crown emperors. It was the Pope who would excommunicate kings. It was the Pope who stood between heaven and earth. And when Charlemagne knelt in St. Peter's on Christmas Day in 800 CE, and the Pope placed a crown upon his head and named him Emperor of the Romans, a strange new truth was born. The empire had died, but its soul lived on in the church. Rome did not disappear. She went to church. She put down the gladius and picked up the gospel. She took off the laurel crown and donned a mitre. She traded roads for rituals, conquest, for conversion imperium, for intercession, and in doing so, she survived. You sit now in the nave of an ancient basilica, San Clemente perhaps, or the Lateran. Light filters through high windows, soft and golden. The marble beneath your feet is worn by centuries of pilgrims. The air is rich with incense and silence. But the silence here does not feel like death. It feels like memory, like presence, like Rome alive but changed. Here in this space, the chants echo where once battle cries rang. Here the prayers outlast the politics. Here the faith once outlawed is now the empire itself. And it does not need legions. It has time. So when they ask, what happened after Rome fell? Tell them this. Rome became the church. Her laws became canon. Her rituals became sacraments. Her emperors became saints. Her enemies became converts. The church did not rise from the ashes. She was already there waiting for the fire to die down. And in that quiet turning, something eternal was born. Not empire, not dominion, but legacy. A legacy whispered in the vaults of cathedrals, carved into chalices, painted on ceilings, bound in books, chanted in cloisters. The empire ended. But Rome, the sacred Rome, the symbolic, stood up from the ruins, wearing white robes and carrying a key. They still called it Eterna Roma, Eternal Rome. Long after her emperors vanished, long after her armies were scattered to the winds, long after her walls crumbled like stale bread under the weight of rain and time, they still believed, not in her power, but in her presence, not in her grandeur, but in her ghost. Because some ruins do not feel like endings. Some feel like echoes, and Rome in her decay whispered louder than she ever had in conquest. Walk through the forum centuries after the fall, and the silence feels heavy. Not dead, not empty, but watchful. Broken columns lean like old men, remembering their prime. The weeds push through tiled floors, once scrubbed by servants of senators. The arches remain not because they are whole, but because they refuse to forget. And under the feet of pilgrims, monks, masons, and time itself, ashes, the ashes of an empire that thought itself eternal, and perhaps in some way was. By the 6th century, many Roman cities were little more than clusters of survivors living in the shadows of dead greatness. The aqueducts had gone dry. The public baths stood cold. The theaters echoed only with birdsong. And yet, the stones remained, and people ever practical began to take them. A marble floor was pried up to make a chapel. A statue of a forgotten god was broken, then reused to pave a street. A bronze nail, once driven into Caesar's rostrum, now held a lantern in a peasant's hut. Rome was not abandoned. She was repurposed. Her eternity, like all things eternal, had changed form. No longer marble and mandate, but memory and matter. Picture a man in the 7th century, let's call him Marcus. He's a builder in a village on the outskirts of old Carthage, a once glorious city that had bowed to Rome before becoming part of her. Now Marcus scours ruined villas for usable stone. He has no Latin, he has no map, but he knows strength when he sees it. The blocks are smoother than anything his own tools could shape, so he takes them, and in his new cottage, a Roman pillar becomes a doorpost. A mosaic is buried beneath straw. A brick from the Colosseum now lines a well, and Rome lives on, not in dominance, but in function. This was not blasphemy. It was continuity. Civilizations are not reborn in palaces. They are reborn in kitchens, in walls, in fires kept warm against the cold. The eternal city did not rise again with trumpets. She lingered, in stone, in story, in silence. Even her name refused to die. Kings who ruled muddy hill forts still claimed to be sons of Rome. Clerics who could barely read still quoted Roman law. Pilgrims trudging from far lands kissed the dust of her roads, hoping to touch the bones of saints, but walking all the while on buried ruins. Drums of forgotten columns, carved cornices, shattered inscriptions. They called it Rome, but it wasn't, and yet somehow it was. You might wonder then, what does it mean for something to be eternal? Is it to last forever untouched? Or is it to be remembered, reused, reimagined? Rome did not stay golden. She did not stay whole, but she stayed. In the hills of Britain, villagers built churches using stones from Hadrian's Wall. In Spain, Roman bridges still carried oxen across rivers that remembered legions. In Gaul, a bishop's crozier bore the shape of an eagle once held by an imperial standard. And in Rome herself, Pantheon became church, Palatine became pasture, Forum became footpath, every monument a mosaic of past and present. Rome's eternity was not in her endurance, but in her transformation. She had burned, she had cracked, she had bled, but she had never disappeared. Her ashes mixed with mortar, her tongue with new dialects, her pride with prayer, her empire with imagination. You sit now on the steps of a church that once housed a Roman Senate hall. Above you, saints smile where senators once argued. Below you, foundations made of centuries, each stone a layer of time. A wind moves through the columns carrying dust and birdsong. And something else, a whisper, a presence, the weight of ashes that refuse to scatter. It's tempting to grieve for the Rome that was, to mourn her legions, her libraries, her order. But history doesn't work like that. She does not bury the past. She composts it. And from that rich decay, something always grows. So when you ask, what became of eternal Rome? Don't look for her in crowns or commands. Look for her in every stone, reused every road that still leads to somewhere older than memory. Look for her in the idea that some things are worth keeping, even in pieces. Look for her in the ashes, still warm, still whispering, still eternal. When a great man dies, they sound the bell. When a city falls, the sky is black with smoke. When a hero breathes his last, someone somewhere sings a dirge. But when Rome faded from the world stage, when the last true breath of her glory slipped quietly into the dark, there was no ceremony, no final prayer, no mourning crowd. There was no funeral for Rome, because no one believed she was dead. Glory doesn't die all at once. It lingers. It pretends. It sits upright long after the soul has gone staring out with hollow eyes. For centuries after the empire's western crown fell to dust, Rome lived on not in strength, but in theater. Kings wrote letters in Latin they could barely read. Peasants walked beneath ruined arches, calling them sacred. Churches borrowed her titles, Pontifex Dioceses Cathedra. Everywhere you looked, someone wore a Roman mask. But inside, there was silence. The glory of Rome had once been a symphony. Trumpets and drumbeat senators shouting in marble halls, the thunder of legions moving like clockwork across a continent. Now it was a faint hum, a low drone carried on the wind, bouncing off broken pillars. A dream recited by men who had never seen the golden days, but had heard of them from grandfathers who once saw aqueducts flow and cities rise like carved jewels from the earth. But dreams are tricky. They blur the line between what was and what we wish had been. Rome in her afterlife became ideal, a fiction of greatness. And fictions don't need funerals. They need believers. So no one buried Rome's glory. They polished it. They carried it like a relic. They dressed it in new robes, even as the bones beneath that robe turned to dust. Consider this. In the early Middle Ages, when Europe trembled with uncertainty and fear, when warlords ruled by sword point and famine kissed every doorstep, what did people dream of? Rome, not the Rome of their crumbling cities, but a Rome of the mind, a Rome of order, of justice, of might, controlled by wisdom. It had never fully existed, but it didn't matter. It had become the light in the fog. There was no funeral, because Rome had become too useful as a ghost. Charlemagne, the Frankish king, who couldn't write his own name, was crowned in 800 CE as Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans, by a pope who spoke the language of Caesar, but served the cross of Christ. It was theater. It was holy. It was powerful. It was not the old Rome, but it wore the old Rome's clothing, and no one questioned the costume. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call Byzantium, survived for another 1,000 years. But it too slowly lost the scent of its origins. Greek replaced Latin. Gold mosaics replaced marble friezes. Emperors were crowned in churches, not on battlefields. And yet, they still called themselves Romans, still believed they were the last light of a fading star, still insisted that the legacy of Romulus and Augustus lived through them. But it was a different light, filtered through stained glass. You walk now through a field outside the ruins of Trier, once one of the great Roman cities of the West. There's nothing glorious here anymore. Only the skeletal arc of a broken gate. Only grass and birds, and the occasional hum of a bee, moving from thistle to thistle. If you dig deep enough, you'll find bricks stamped with imperial names. You'll find graves that held men who once believed in the greatness of Rome. And yet no marker says, here lies the empire, because no one knew exactly where it had ended. And no one dared to admit it. Glory doesn't need to die. It only needs to be replaced. And what replaced Roman glory? Not another empire, but a mosaic of smaller dreams. A kingdom here, a bishopric there, a monastery on a hill, a market town reborn from a Roman forum. Every piece carved from the ruins, every new name carrying a trace of the old. So perhaps the question isn't, why wasn't there a funeral? But what would we have buried? The marble already stolen, the scrolls already scattered, the senators forgotten, the laws translated and warped, the glory still hanging in the air like the last note of a song, long after the singer had gone. And maybe, just maybe, no one held a funeral because they feared the truth that funerals force us to face. That something is truly finally gone. And Rome was never meant to be gone. She was meant to be forever. So they kept pretending, even as the roof caved in, even as the world changed its name. You sit now in the ruins of an old Roman theater. The stage is cracked, the seats overtaken by weeds, and yet you can still imagine the actors stepping out, robes fluttering the crowd, holding its breath. You hear applause from centuries ago. You see a world that thought itself immortal, speaking its last lines without knowing they were the end. And then, curtain, no eulogy, no black-cloaked mourners, just silence, and the echo of a story that refused to die. There are dreams so vast, so luminous, so deeply woven into the fabric of civilization that even time itself cannot unmake them. Rome was one of those dreams. The empire died, yes. Its buildings collapsed. Its armies vanished. Its emperors were reduced to footnotes in dusty manuscripts. But the idea of Rome, that never died. It couldn't, because too many people needed it. They needed it when the roads fell into disrepair and the bridges washed away. They needed it when warlords ruled by fire and kings rose from little more than muscle and fear. They needed it when the world became small again, when maps shrank, when books were lost, when candles burned in monasteries as the only light against centuries of darkness. In the silence left by empire, the dream of Rome became a beacon, not a memory, a destination. Look closely and you'll see it everywhere. In parchment inked by trembling monks, where Latin still flickered like an old flame. In the stones of chapels where Roman columns supported Christian crosses. In the coronation of kings who called themselves emperors, even when they ruled villages, because to be Roman still meant legitimate. To rule without Rome behind your name, that was to rule without blessing. The dream traveled. It wore new robes. It changed names. It crossed the Alps and took root in cold northern soil. It whispered in the ear of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, who by 800 CE had carved a vast realm across Europe. His advisors spoke Latin. His scribes copied Roman law. His coronation by the Pope in St. Peter's was not just a ceremony, it was an echo. The Pope crowned him Emperor of the Romans. But there was no Rome in his empire, only the memory of one. And that was enough. Later, the German kings followed suit. They too were crowned in Rome. They too claimed the old titles. Their realm would be called the Holy Roman Empire, a name that was neither holy nor Roman, nor truly an empire. But it proved the point. The dream lived on, even when absurd, even when hollow, even when no one remembered the difference between a consul and a centurion. They still believed, because belief is more powerful than truth. And it wasn't just kings, It was scholars, in the court of Frederick II in the 13th century, who spoke Latin, Greek, and Arabic. The idea of Rome as a center of knowledge returned. It was architects. They saw in Roman ruins the bones of something perfect, arches, domes, pillars, and copied them, birthing the Renaissance. It was artists and poets who painted Caesar and Cicero like saints, who draped Venus in Christian modesty and called her wisdom. Rome became a mirror every age looked into and saw itself elevated. The Republic noble and rational, the Empire strong and ordered, the law universal, the culture eternal. It did not matter if these reflections were accurate. What mattered was that Rome had become a language of aspiration. To build a city of stone, you were rebuilding Rome. To organize a legal system, you were preserving Rome. To claim divine right to rule, you needed Rome to bless it. Even in the East, where Constantinople stood like a polished relic, the dream remained sharp. The Byzantine emperors wore Roman titles. They administered Roman law. They told themselves that they were the last flame until that too went out in 1453 when the Ottomans took the city. And even then, the conquerors stood in Hagia Sophia, awed by what Rome had left behind. They did not burn it. They converted it, and Rome lived on now, whispered in another tongue. What kind of dream refuses to die? A dream that fills the gaps in history. A dream that replaces fear with memory. A dream that tells us we can be more than what we are if only we remember what we were. You stand now at the edge of the Tiber River. The sun is low. The water moves slowly. You look around at the city, not the Rome of Augustus or Trajan, but the Rome of today. Traffic hums on distant streets. Tourists chatter in a dozen languages. A man sells espresso from a cart not far from the ruins of a Republican temple. And yet, it's all still here. Not just the stones, the story, the shape of the dream, the way buildings still mimic the proportions of ancient basilicas, the way laws still cite Roman codes, the way every capital city in the Western world claims to be the new Rome in some quiet, arrogant way. Washington, London, Paris, Vienna, Moscow, all reflections, all dreams cast in Roman light. And maybe that's what Rome always was, not just a place or a power, but a container for human longing, for greatness, for order, for immortality. The empire fell, but the longing didn't. It just changed shape. So no, Rome didn't vanish. Rome became a language of hope, a structure of belief, a promise that we too could build something that lasts longer than ourselves. You sit now beneath a fig tree, near where the ancient Senate once met. The voices are long gone, but the wind still carries whispers. And one of them says, we are still here, not in stone, not in sword, but in soul. And perhaps that is the most eternal thing of all. Once to say the word Rome was to speak with certainty. Rome was the center of the map, the source of law, the maker of roads, the queen of the world. But centuries passed. The legions dissolved into legend. The forums became fields. The emperors were remembered only in stained manuscripts and crumbling inscriptions. And slowly something strange happened. Rome stopped being an answer and became a question. In the beginning, Rome had defined itself in action. We conquer, therefore we are. We legislate, therefore we endure. But after the empire's voice faded, The world began to ask quietly at first, then louder. What was Rome really? A city, a people, a language, a system of law, a style of architecture, a dream. Or was Rome something even harder to pin down? A myth that dressed itself in marble. You could see it most clearly in the Middle Ages, when kings and priests and emperors all invoked Rome with reverence but contradiction. A Gothic king in Italy called himself Rex Romanorum, King of the Romans, while his soldiers couldn't read a word of Latin. A German emperor claimed to restore the Roman Empire, while his capital was 700 miles north of the Tiber. A pope crowned a French-speaking monarch with Roman rights, even as Roman families begged for bread beneath broken statues. Everyone wanted to be Roman, but no one agreed on what that meant. And so the question deepened. Was Rome the Republic or the Empire? Was it Caesar or Cicero? Was it Augustus or the Apostle? Was it the brutality of conquest or the brilliance of roads and rights? Was it the crucifier of Christ or the cradle of Christianity? Was it a pagan colossus or the mother of the church? Every age answered differently, because Rome by then had become a mirror, a vast echoing mirror, and each generation saw in it whatever it needed. To the Byzantines, Rome was continuity, a legacy carried east, polished in gold and icons. To the Holy Roman Empire, it was legitimacy, a seal of ancient power pressed into new crowns. To the Renaissance, Rome was perfection, a lost ideal to imitate in sculpture, in architecture, in governance. To Enlightenment thinkers, Rome was caution, a warning of republics turned to tyranny. To revolutionaries, Rome was inspiration, a model of civic virtue and citizenhood. To colonizers, Rome was justification proof that empires could and should stretch over the world. To artists, Rome was aesthetics. To poets, melancholy. To historians, puzzle. To dreamers, hope. And in all of that echoing, all of that reinterpretation, something astonishing happened. Rome became timeless, not because it remained the same, but because it never did. You walk now through the Palatine Museum. Marble faces stare at you across centuries, imperial, austere, serene, cracked. There is Hadrian beard chiseled with care. There is Augustus youthful and eternal. There is Marcus Aurelius, eyes wide with philosophy and fatigue. But what are they now? Not rulers, not gods. They are questions. Who were these men? Why did they rise? Why did their world fall? What did they mean then? And what do they mean now? Rome has no answer to give you. Only silence. Only stone. Somewhere, a young student flips open a book of Roman history. She reads of the Senate, the Gracchi, the fall of the Republic, the rise of empire. She frowns, puzzled and fascinated. She underlines a sentence in red. She's not sure if she agrees with it, but something stirs. Not clarity, not conclusion, curiosity. And so Rome lives again, not in empire, but in the act of asking. Because here is the truth. No textbook can fully explain. Rome became immortal, not by being understood, but by being questioned. Was she cruel? Yes. Was she brilliant? Also yes. Did she enslave? Yes. Did she build? Yes. Was she necessary? Was she inevitable? Was she doomed? Was she glorious? Was she ever real? Ask 100 people. Here, 100 answers. And that, in the end, is the answer. Rome is the question that never resolves. Not every civilization earns that. Most are buried, forgotten, flattened by time. But Rome remains open. In every column still standing. In every legal principle still cited. In every novel, opera, or movie that dares to retell her rise and fall. She invites us in to explore, to imagine, to argue. You sit now in a quiet cafe in the shadow of the Pantheon. The air smells of coffee stone and the faint sweetness of history. Around you, people murmur in many languages. A tourist guide holds up a brochure. A pigeon walks over ancient paving stones like it owns the place. You sit slowly, and you realize Rome is still here, not just in ruins, not just in memories, but in your mind, and in the question forming at the back of it, what was this place really? And more importantly, why does it still matter? Not all endings are violent. Some don't break. They fade. They thin out until what once felt like stone underfoot becomes vapor in your hands, so light, so soft, so quiet, you hardly realize it's gone. That is how Rome ended. Not in a single battle. Not with cities set aflame. Not even with the fall of a boy emperor or the sack of her sacred heart. But slowly, quietly, like mist at dawn. It's strange, isn't it? To imagine an empire that once ruled over 50 million souls, governing deserts and rivers, mountains and seas, gods, and laws, lives, and legacies simply melting away. But that is what happened. Not all at once, not even with purpose, but over time. Step into the 5th century. Rome still stands, but she doesn't know who she is. Her soldiers speak different tongues. Her borders shrink like receding tides. Her emperors are chosen by generals. Her cities are held together with habit and hope. People still call her Rome, but she is already something else. The signs are subtle. The taxes are harder to collect. The roads go unrepaired. Local warlords begin to decide justice instead of imperial governors. A letter sent to the capital never gets a reply. But no one panics. Not at first. They adapt. They wait. They hope that things will return to the way they were. They don't. And then one day, no different from any other Rome is no longer Rome. The name still exists, but the system behind it has collapsed. Not because it was attacked, but because it stopped working, like a heart that simply forgets to beat. Empires do not always fall. Sometimes they are forgotten, until a child asks why the aqueduct no longer flows, until a village no longer sends grain to the governor, until a magistrate's seal means nothing to the man with a sword, until the Latin spoken in courts becomes the vulgar tongue of farmers, until the marble facade is repainted and reborn as a church. And by then, there is nothing left to mourn, because everything has already changed. It's tempting to search for a date, a single year, a moment to circle in red ink and declare, here. This is when it ended, but no such line exists. There is no hour when Rome drew her last breath, only 1,000 moments of quiet erosion. A senator dies, and no one replaces him. A temple closes, and no one prays there again. A road is swallowed by mud. A law is miscopied in a dusty monastery. A soldier chooses to serve a local duke instead of a distant emperor. Each one is small. Each one is ordinary. Together they form a silence. You walk now through the ruins of a Roman bathhouse. Once this place steamed with the breath of citizens and senators. Marble tiles shone under lamplight. Conversations echoed in arched vaults. Now grass creeps through the cracks. Birdsong replaces politics. The columns are bare, and yet there is no grief here. Only stillness, only the quiet knowledge that time has passed. When mist disappears, we do not cry for it. We accept that the air is clear again. We go on. So too with Rome. When she finally vanished, there was no funeral, because the people had already begun living new lives. Not Roman lives, but lives of their own making. The bishop replaces the governor. The manor replaces the forum. The oath to an emperor becomes an oath to a local king. The Latin phrase becomes a vernacular proverb, and no one protests, because survival matters more than memory. And what was Rome to a peasant who needed food? What was Imperium to a mother watching her child cough through the night? What was eternity to people who just wanted another harvest? History does not always announce its turning points. Sometimes it whispers them, and if no one is listening, they pass without notice. Until one day, centuries later, someone like you walks through the remains and asks, when did it end? And the ruins do not answer. They only sigh. But do not mistake this for failure. What dissolves does not always disappear. Rome's mist seeped into the soil. It became the Latin in your books, the law in your contracts, the grid in your cities, the language in your prayers, the dreams in your imagination. The empire ended, but its particles scattered across history. Invisible, indelible. And so if you walk the old roads, now don't search for Rome's body. You won't find it. Search instead for her imprint, in the way we think of government, in how we build walls, in how we tell stories of greatness and fall, in how we yearn for something eternal. Rome is not in the ruins. Rome is in the mist. All around you. You sit now beside a crumbling milestone on the Appian Way. The sky is dimming. The birds have gone quiet. A breeze stirs the tall grass. You touch the stone. Faint lettering is still there, Latin, worn and shallow. It once told a traveler how far they were from the heart of the world. Now it tells you something softer. That no great thing truly ends, it only changes state. And as dusk settles like a shroud, you feel it. Not loss, but continuity. Not a collapse, but a soft letting go. And with it, the understanding that the greatest empires do not fall. They fade, and they become something else. There are ruins. We can see arches that lean against the wind columns that have forgotten the weight they once held, streets that vanish into grass. And then there are ruins we carry inside us, traces of an empire long dissolved, still beating beneath the skin of modern life. We may not speak Latin anymore, at least not knowingly. We don't wear togas or salute eagles cast in bronze. But Rome walks beside us quietly, in words, in laws, in names, in instincts so old we forget they had to be invented. Stand in any courtroom, hear the structure of the trial, testimony, defense, sentence. That's Rome, not the stones of the forum, but the form of the argument. Not the emperor's decree, but the rule of law, written, organized, appealed, codified. Cicero would have understood the rhythm. So would Justinian. Even today, legal systems across Europe still echo Rome's corpus juris civilis. Latin phrases persist. Habeas corpus pro bono subpoena. Amicus curiae. The empire is gone, but its voice still shapes justice. Look at our cities. The way roads radiate from a central point. The symmetry. The logic. That was Rome's genius to make the world legible. A place with order, with pattern, with permanence. Even now, when we design a capital, we think of Rome. When we build domes and rotundas, we invoke her temples. When we lift our eyes to arches to vaults, to the curvature of space held aloft by geometry, we are inside Rome's imagination. Even your calendar this very day you are living bears the mark of emperors. January for Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings. March for Mars, god of war. July for Julius Caesar. August for Augustus. And the idea of 12 months of leap years of counting days, not by moons, but by fixed logic. All Rome, you can throw out your clocks, cancel every appointment. But you're still living in Caesar's time. And the languages we speak, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, all daughters of Latin. Even English, though. Germanic at heart carries thousands of Roman borrowings. Justice, memory, empire, city, victory, power. They sound like simple words, but they were once cornerstones. Now they're part of your every sentence. Rome whispers through your tongue. Even in religion, Rome lingers. Not just in cathedrals and crucifixes, but in the very structure of the church. Dioceses, cardinals, pontiffs, the hierarchy, the ceremonies, the sense that time is divided into sacred days, into holy offices, into rituals that link the present to a more glorious past. The early Christians did not just inherit Rome's roads. They inherited her architecture of authority, and they rebuilt it in faith. But it's not just buildings and systems and words. Rome left us something deeper, a way of imagining power. We still talk of republics, of senates, of citizenship. We still wrestle with the questions that haunted the Roman Republic. How do you balance freedom and stability? Who should rule and who should speak? How much power is too much for one person? How do we protect a state from itself? Every revolution that came after Rome asked those questions in her shadow. From France to America, to the echo chambers of today's democracies, Rome still debates through us. Even our stories come from her. The epic hero, the fall of the great, the noble traitor, the decline of virtue, the rise of tyranny. Shakespeare reached for Rome. So did Machiavelli, and Dante, and Gibbon. Hollywood too, Rome on fire, on horseback, in love at war. Because to tell a story of glory and fall is to tell the story of Rome. And yet Rome is not always noble in the memory. She enslaved, she conquered, she crushed resistance. She celebrated cruelty as spectacle. To carry her traces is not to praise her blindly. It is to acknowledge the complex inheritance. The roads she built led to both justice and genocide. The laws she left were written in ink and in blood. Rome was never pure. She was human on a scale we had never seen. You walk now through a quiet plaza. Pigeons scatter. A child kicks a ball near a ruined column. An old man waters plants that grow against a wall built in the time of Hadrian. And you realize Rome is not just in museums. It's in moments, in gestures, in the spine of cities, and the language of ambition. In the way we still believe that greatness can be built from stone and law and dream. We did not ask for Rome to live in us, but she does. She stitched herself into the fabric of the West, and through that, into the world. And though she faded like mist, her traces endure, not to haunt us, but to remind us that even when greatness dissolves, it leaves behind shape. It leaves behind questions. It leaves behind possibility. You touch a wall. The stone is warm from the sun. It does not speak, but in its silence you hear everything. That you are not alone in history. That you walk with ghosts. That the past is not behind you, but beneath you. Every step a whisper, every breath a trace. If you go looking for the death of Rome, you won't find a corpse. There is no imperial tomb carved with a final date. No shattered statue with a plaque that reads, "Here ended the eternal city." No funeral fire on the Palatine Hill. No last word whispered by a dying emperor. That's because Rome never truly died. She transformed, changed her name, changed her face, changed her voice, and quietly, imperceptibly, slipped into the bloodstream of the world. There are some things in history that do not break apart. They dissolve like sugar in warm wine. The taste remains long after the crystals are gone. So it was with Rome. After the last emperor in the West was deposed, after the legions faded into mercenary bands, after the Curia sat empty, and the Senate became a memory, people did not stop calling themselves Roman. The world around them had changed, but the name still carried weight. A farmer in Gaul still tithed to a local bishop who wrote in Latin. A merchant in Alexandria still counted his profits in solidus and denarii. A general in Constantinople still signed orders in the name of the Imperium Romanum. Even centuries later, when Charlemagne ruled from Aachen and popes crowned kings under candlelight in cold basilicas, they did so in imitation, not rejection of Rome. Rome had gone inward, because Rome was never just about borders or buildings. It was a system, a script, a shape the world had grown used to. Even in its ruins, that shape endured. It became the mold for everything that followed. You see it in medieval capitals modeled after Roman plans, in laws that follow Roman definitions of property and contract, in institutions that mirror the old Senate, the old courts, the old army, in the way we imagine power, not just as might, but as order. Rome gave the world a blueprint, and even as she fell apart, that blueprint remained. There's a temptation to speak of history as linear. One thing begins and another ends. But Rome refuses to fit into that narrative. She bleeds across the timeline. You can't tell where she stops and her inheritors begin. Was the Roman Empire still alive in the courts of Byzantium, in the laws of the Carolingians, in the visions of Renaissance thinkers, in the very language used to record its death? Or had it already become something else? A shadow, a skeleton, a soul. You walk now through a field in North Africa. The heat is dry. The ground beneath you crunches with stone and grass. Here once stood a Roman villa. You can still see the outline, a few half-buried walls, a faded mosaic depicting a dolphin in blue tile. A shepherd leads his goats across the ruins. They step over history like it is earth, because to them it is. The foundation of the present. The proof that things survive not by standing tall, but by becoming part of the landscape. Rome did not fall. She flowed. She flowed into monasteries where monks copied ancient texts, one letter at a time. She flowed into Gothic palaces where kings wrote laws on Roman scrolls. She flowed into mosques and synagogues, into cathedrals and marketplaces. She flowed into the very concept of civilization. We speak of falling into barbarism as if Rome is still the yardstick by which order is measured. We say modern Rome when a city feels important. We say Romanesque when we mean noble, classic, solid. Rome is no longer a place. Rome is a language of structure, of ambition, of endurance. Not everyone saw the transformation. Some mourned her. Others tried to restore her. But the truth is, she didn't need restoration because she had already planted herself inside the future and begun to bloom in strange new forms. A cathedral built atop a forum. A university curriculum that begins with Cicero. A map of Europe still echoing the provinces of an ancient empire. A law school lecture quoting the institutes of Justinian. These are not remnants. They are reincarnations. And in art, in philosophy, in architecture, in governance, the ghost of Rome whispers, try to last, build in stone, name your virtues, fear chaos, honor order, leave something behind. And we listen. Whether we know it or not, you sit now in a quiet cloister. The air smells of old stone and lavender. A column nearby has a Roman base, though the capital is Gothic. Time stacks here eras, folded over one another like pages in a book too often read. A bell tolls in the distance. You close your eyes, and you feel it. Not loss, not nostalgia, but presence. Rome is here, not as empire, not as ruin, but as architecture of memory. She did not die, she changed her shape. Into Europe, into the West, into the very world you live in. So when you hear that Rome fell, you can smile and whisper back, she didn't fall, she adapted, she endured, she became us. Are you still awake? If so, that's okay. And if your eyes have already closed, that's okay too. Let me whisper just a little longer. A few final words before you drift away. We've walked far together, through the rise and fall of something that once thought itself eternal. We followed Rome from her mythic birth in Wolf's Breath and River Reeds, to her steel-clad triumphs across the world, to her slow, silent fading, not with a scream, but with a sigh. We watched her split shiver forget herself. We watched her collapse inward like a star too heavy with its own brilliance. And yet, she never truly died. Rome simply changed her shape. That, I think, is what stays with me most. Not her legions, not her emperors, not the marble or the gold. But this truth she endured by letting go. She melted into the world she had once ruled. Not vanishing, but softening, becoming a river beneath the surface of time. A word, a habit, a rhythm in the way cities breathe, and laws are written, and dreams are spoken. And perhaps that's the quiet comfort I want to leave with you tonight. That even the greatest things, those that feel unshakable, may fall. But what matters most doesn't always shatter. It transforms. It lingers in language, in memory, in kindness, in resilience. You see, Rome was never just about conquest. It was about continuity, about rising after collapse, about adapting, about holding on. And maybe you are Rome too. Maybe you are standing in the ruins of something you once believed was eternal. A relationship, a home, a part of yourself. Maybe you've felt that soft erosion, the slow undoing of something you tried so hard to hold together. But you're still here, still breathing, still building. That is what Rome teaches us in the end. Not how to rule the world, but how to survive it. So let this story not be a lament, but a lullaby. Let it wrap around you like ivy over old stone. Let the past fall away gently like the dust on a forgotten road. You do not need to carry it all tonight. You do not need to rebuild the empire. You only need to rest. Close your eyes. The stars above the ruins still shine. The wind moves softly through broken archways, and the world, imperfect as it is, continues to turn, quietly, gently. And you, child of Rome, of dust of dream, you have walked far enough for now. Sleep, sleep in the shadow of fallen columns. Sleep beneath skies that watched both Caesar and the nameless. Sleep like the world is still whole, because in some way it is. And tomorrow you will rise again, not as a conqueror, but as someone who remembers